Humblemud.
In my recent Q&A video, I explained that I have a tendency to think way too hard about things that don't really matter that much. But when I started looking into this particular thing that I couldn't help but notice time and time again, it ended up becoming a fun little topic that took me down a rabbit hole surprisingly deep, and I don't see anyone else making videos about it, so I'd like to get this out there for any of those like me who may have wondered. In a lot of Japanese media and media in general, the elements and the characters who represent and manipulate those elements are color-coded. The easiest example I can think of to explain this is fire. Think of all the fictional characters who have some sort of pyrokinetic proficiency. I guarantee you that a large majority of them will be clothed in a red hue or are literally red beings. Water is another easy example. Think of Squirtle, think of the Zoras from The Legend of Zelda. Heck, even the Power Rangers with water abilities usually wear blue. These colors make a lot of sense for the elements that we're talking about here. Fire is often represented by red, the color of danger, hunger, passion. Hence, if we're upset, we might refer to that as getting really heated. And water is often understandably represented in blue. Calm, serenity, drowning, things like that. But how do you represent the element of wind? Wind is not a force that you physically see in the wild unless it's in the form of something like a tornado or hurricane, and if you're making something like an RPG and are trying to represent this element, the two most common colors you might suggest for wind are usually already taken. Maybe when you think of wind, you think of the sky. That makes sense, right? But 9 times out of 10, blue is already taken by water. Okay, maybe white to represent those big gusts of wind? Well, usually white is already taken by light magic, holy magic, or healing magic. And so when we think of the usual 4 basic elements that we see in a lot of games and media in general, while it's easy to use red to represent fire, blue for water, and a brown or orangish tint to represent earth, a lot of times, not all the time, especially if you're Avatar: The Last Airbender, but a lot of times, wind is colored green. Like I said, of course there are exceptions, but even as a kid I noticed this. I grew up loving and consuming a lot of Japanese media, and I noticed early on that there were numerous occasions where wind was represented by the color green. The first time I noticed this was with a particular JRPG, but as I've gone on, I've found this phenomenon in lots of different media. The earliest example of green wind that I ever remember encountering in my personal life was with The Legend of Dragoon. Every party member in this game is aligned to some sort of element, and wind-based characters like Levitz, Albert, and Graham wear green exclusively. Their magic is often represented in a green hue, and even the wind dragon spirit that they are empowered by is housed within a very green jade gemstone. And when we look at anime, I think of how I've been recently diving back into Yu Hakusho, a gem I watched a bunch as a kid, and in Season 1, Episode 13, we can clearly see the demon Rando power up with a green energy as he gets ready to release Sickle and Tornado, which is also known as the Violent Beheading Wind-Air Formation, and guess what? Those blades of wind are green. Paikon from Dragon Ball Z is literally green, and he's a character who you may remember as the one who introduces us to probably the most famous wind-based technique in Dragon Ball, the Hyper Tornado. And while I'm not far enough into the game to get the footage of this myself, one quick Google will tell you that this move would go on to later be depicted with a sort of gray-green hue in Dragon Ball Z Xenoverse 2. Are you not convinced yet that something is going on here? Am I reaching? Well, yeah, maybe I was a bit with that last one especially. Fair enough. Let me give you a few more concrete examples. In Tales of Arise, every wind spell and technique is represented with green winds. The icon for the wind element is colored green as well. The god of the skies in Pokémon, Rayquaza, green. Furiken, the primal beast of wind in Grand Blue Fantasy Relink, green. Greatest RPG of all time, Quest 64, green. No, I'm just kidding. Wind is represented by the color green, and many of the game's wind spells are green as well. Ivan from Golden Sun, who looks like he could be Brian from Quest 64's brother and starts out the game belonging to the Wind Seer class, wears green. Wind spells in Disgaea are pretty much always green. Wind spells in Castlevania are green. Rivali's Gale in Zelda Breath of the Wild is green. Wind spells in Romancing Saga 2 are green. Wind iconography is represented by the color green in Fire Emblem and in Yokai Watch, and wind spells are usually usually green in Fire Emblem. Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest can be a bit inconsistent from game to game, but Final Fantasy's wind spell Arrow is pretty much exclusively green no matter what game you're playing. The Spirit of Wind herself in Dragon Quest VII has a green color scheme, and though it was a mobile game in Dragon Quest Tact, wind spells were represented by a green tornado. Also, before the hero is able to use his wind spell Up B in Smash Bros, he powers up with a little green energy. Now do you think I might be onto something? I'm sure that there are probably a lot more examples I haven't even mentioned that you guys can think of. And I know some of you are likely thinking that there are probably more practical reasons why wind is often green in Japanese media, the simplest being that designers want to represent the primary colors where they can, and red and blue are taken, so you've gotta give green to something, right? Another reason why wind might be seen as green is because the wind often moves through the trees and carries leaves around in nature, and with leaves generally being green, naturally a green tornado isn't really all that crazy to imagine in fictional media. You know, like that really cool green leaf tornado that you run through in Sonic Adventure, or the giant green tornado you see in Sonic Lost World sucking out the planet's life force. Or how about the legendary Wind Master Jet the Hawk from Sonic Riders, you know, that little bird dude with green feathers? Wind is officially green in Sonic. Boom! So while there are practical, boring reasons for green wind in Japanese media, and again I know there are exceptions, there is a more interesting, less boring, more historical potential explanation for wind's green depiction, especially when we're talking about Japanese media. While there are a ton of gods, also known as kami, within the Japanese religion Shinto, there are what is known as major and minor kami. I'm going to simplify this for you a lot for the sake of time, and because what is considered a major kami by one person or website or publication or area is not always considered a major kami by another. Plus, there is also this concept of 8 million gods in Shinto, meaning that there are basically a limitless number of gods in our world, considering that in the Shinto religion, godliness resides in pretty much everything. So I'm only going to focus on a few major kami here. But essentially just know that your major kami are going to be the names that you likely recognize if you've been around the block with Japanese media. Amaterasu, for example, is generally considered to be the head of the Japanese pantheon of gods, as she's the goddess of the sun. Of course, if you've ever played Okami, you are probably aware that the game's famous White Wolf is based on this ancient Japanese goddess. Two other major gods I'd like to direct your attention to are a bit of a pair, being brothers, that is Raijin and Fujin. Raijin is the god of thunder, and he has had quite the influence on media all around the world, even in Western markets. For example, you can play as him in Smite, but a more famous interpretation of him over here in the States can be found in Mortal Kombat's Raiden. Raijin's brother Fujin is the god of wind, and while both are brothers and both are Oni, they have some differences in their portrayal. Though Raijin is interpreted with a variety of different skin colors depending on the source, Fujin is always represented with green skin. And this forms the basis for my theory on why wind is so often represented by the color green in Japanese media, as it's so historically significant to the portrayal of the ancient Japanese major god of wind, Fujin. And really quick, back to the topic of Mortal Kombat, Fujin is also a playable character in that game, as you may know as well, and often has green accents in his design. Good on you, NRS. While it may seem silly at a glance to think that wind's often green portrayal in video games and anime is simply because Fujin, the god of wind, is also green, you have to remember how significant mythology is in Japanese media as a whole, and how often it's represented, or referenced to, or respected in Japanese media. Earlier, I referenced Yu Hakusho's Rando, who has this violent beheading wind attack. And when I was researching this further, I started wondering if this move was perhaps inspired by the Kama Itachi. These are Japanese yokai, little dust devils known for creating razor winds by flying through the air and spinning rapidly with their razor-sharp limbs. While Pokémon is extremely inconsistent with its choice of color in general, there are several instances of the move Razor Wind being depicted with that same greenish hue that we see in Yu Hakusho. Yet again, another reference to the spirit or godly energy of wind being represented in green in popular Japanese media. And clearly Pokémon's designers are well aware of Fujin. Just look at the Pokémon Tornadus, who basically is Pokémon's take on Fujin. Like I said earlier, Raijin's color tends to change depending on the source, so I think Thunderous's blue hue is excusable, but anything taking influence from and respecting Fujin's portrayal tends to be keen on sticking to a green design. While nowadays wind spells might be colored green just because that's just how it's always been, as I'm sure most character designers today never think, oh, I better color my next wind-based character in green to honor Fujin, when you start tracing all of this back through animation and video game history, I don't think it's too far-fetched to ultimately draw the origins of this recurring design decision in Japanese media back to the major wind kami himself, Fujin. And I've been referencing a lot of older anime so far, but even more modern anime like Demon Slayer features green aesthetics when the characters use wind breathing, and the wind Hashira, Sanemi, wears green. It just seems to be this unspoken tradition that I see so often in Japanese media, whether it's a video game or anime, that I started to wonder if it was just coincidence or if it was something worth looking into. And though it would be impossible really to verify all of this, I think it's a fun, harmless thing to keep in our collective anime and JRPG headcanons. I found it really interesting and I hope you guys did too. Anyways, if you're still here, thanks so much for watching, and as always, stay humble.